war in the Mediterranean raged for almost 4 years. There were the initial British triumphs in Italian Somaliland. In the combat in North Africa, the Desert Rats and the Africa Corps chased each other back and forth. The campaign in the Mediterranean finally ended in northern Italy. This long and bitter combat is less remembered now than the Eastern and Western fronts in Europe. The Allied powers in the Mediterranean first ignored the lessons of air power, then used them brilliantly for a brief period. Those lessons were then forgotten before being finally revived, improved upon, and made standard. It is difficult to understand how the Western powers could have observed the brilliant success of the German Army and Luftwaffe in combined operations and not attempt to emulate it. Yet it was not until mid-1942 that a formal attempt was made to coordinate Army and Air Force activities as the Germans did.
The importance of the Mediterranean area was evident to the leaders of all warring nations. Churchill would have preferred to fight the entire war there, pecking round its edges to reach what he called the soft underbelly of Europe. That way, he would have avoided an invasion that for the third time would place the British Army in combat with the Germans in France.
Hitler placed less importance on the area, but he did have grandiose ideas about using Egypt as a jumping-off spot for an invasion of the Middle East.
In sheer size, the Mediterranean theater was larger than the Russian front. It extended 2,200 miles from Gibraltar to the Suez Canal. It averaged 500 miles in width. In its own way, it could be as inhospitable as Russia, with long seasons of blazing heat and sandstorms instead of driving snow. Russia and the Mediterranean had many things in common. One was mud. Torrential rains in Africa could turn the ground into muddy swamps that were even more difficult to cover than the Russian bogs. Another similarity was the dependence on tenuous supply lines. In Russia, the German lifeline was the railroad. That was subject to constant guerrilla attacks and had to be supplemented by airlift. In North Africa, the Germans depended on ships rather than trains. They used cargo aircraft to a greater degree than in Russia.
Air combat in the Mediterranean was initiated by the Italians. They made the first of many attacks on Malta on June 11, 1940. Immediately after the declaration of war. Before the war, Mussolini had used the Italian Air Force, the Regia Aeronautica, as a fascist showpiece. In the late 20s and early 30s, his backing enabled Italian flyers to set many records. In 1933, the brilliant airman General Italo Balbo led a flight of Savoia Marchetti flying boats from Ortebello in Italy to Chicago. In 1934, Lieutenant Francesco Agello flew his Macchi Castaldi seaplane to a world record speed of 440 miles an hour. At the beginning of the war, the Regia Aeronautica had 1,800 first-line aircraft. More than half were bombers. Most of those were the three-engine Savoia Marchetti Sparrowhawks. The Sparrowhawk's performance compared well with the German Heinkel HE-111 or the British Bristol Blenheim. It had a top speed of 270 miles an hour. It could cover 1,242 miles with a 2,755-pound bomb load. Its wood and fabric construction made it vulnerable to small caliber shell fire. It flamed readily. But the pilots loved its maneuverability, and it was easy to maintain. Its major uses were as a level bomber and as a close support plane, but the Sparrowhawk was probably the best torpedo bomber of the war in any air force. The Italian Air Force entered the war with obsolete fighters. Most of them were the elegant Fiat CR-42 Falco. They were the last biplane fighter manufactured by any of the nations involved in World War II. The biplane configuration lent itself to the natural talents of the Italian flyers, who excelled in aerobatics. The CR-42s were so maneuverable that British Hurricane pilots had to adopt the tactic of avoiding dogfights and using dives and zooms to gain the advantage. The early Italian monoplane fighters, the Fiat G50 Frecchia and the Macchi Castoldi Saetta, were delightful to fly, but they did not have the maneuverability of the CR-42s or the speed of the British fighters. Italy had no powerful modern engine to place in its fighters. Later, when German engines were fitted, the story was different. The sleek Macchi Castoldi Folgore would easily dominate the P-40s and Hurricanes in Africa. Later versions of these fighters were equivalent in most respects to the Focke-Wulf FW-190 or the North American Mustang. All Italian fighters were handicapped by lack of firepower. The few guns they had were of inferior performance. Overall, the Italian Air Force was deficient in quantity and serviceability. Only 1,500 of the Centauro and Folgore fighters would be delivered before Italy's capitulation in 1943.
Serviceability levels often fell to as low as 30%. One of the problems was that the Italian fighter designs were too elegant for the tough North African theater. If the British Hurricane was a Ford, the Macchi Castoldi Folgore was a Ferrari. Italy had long experience in North Africa, but Air Force maintenance personnel failed to provide such basic necessities as tropical filters to keep the delicate engines running. The Italian Air Force had brave, capable leaders at the squadron level and below, but it suffered from corrupt incompetence at the top. One Italian general said he enjoyed military life because of its comfortable pay and the assurance of excellent pasta daily. There was a total lack of foresight in everything, from basic strategy to procurement, logistics, and training.
But courage in the cockpit was not lacking. The Italian pilots flew hard and well under difficult circumstances. They distinguished themselves in difficult battles in Africa, the Balkans, Russia, and even their homeland. One of the most highly regarded Regia Aeronautica heroes was Major Carlo Emanuele Buscaglia. He flew SM-79 torpedo planes with great elan. The Regia Aeronautica was reluctant to glorify individuals. It appears that Major Adriano Visconti and Captain Franco Lucchini were the leading aces, each with 26 victories. Despite a shortage of leaders and equipment, the Italian Air Force fought bravely, sometimes alone, sometimes with the Luftwaffe. Its first campaign was an assault on a tough little island in the Mediterranean. the island of Malta, which was vital British territory.
One of the great myths of the war is that three ancient Gloucester Sea Gladiator biplanes named Faith, Hope and Charity held out alone against the full might of Mussolini's air force. The story is almost true. In fact, there were 18 Sea Gladiators in storage on Malta. 6 were already assembled and the remainder were used for spare parts in the battle. In the autumn of 1940, following the fall of France, the Italian attacks on Malta diminished. The air officer commanding in Malta, Air Vice Marshal Hugh P. Lloyd, was determined to turn Malta into an offensive base. Lloyd reinforced Malta with Hawker Hurricanes and Fairey Fulmars. The Fulmar was a development of this aircraft, the unsuccessful Fairey battle. Next, he brought in Martin Maryland reconnaissance aircraft, Vickers Wellington bombers, and short Sunderland flying boats. Malta was transformed into a formidable threat. The Wellingtons began attacking targets as far away as Tripoli and Albania. The importance of the role of the Martin Maryland's reconnaissance was highlighted on November the 10th, 1940. They reported that a large Italian naval fleet was in Taranto harbor in southern Italy. Fleet Air Arm Fairey Swordfish torpedo aircraft took off from the carrier Illustrious on a successful raid against the fleet. The Italians appealed to the Luftwaffe for help against Lloyd's aggressive tactics.
The veteran Fliegerkorps 10, the most experienced anti-shipping unit in the world, was sent to Sicily. It arrived in January 1941. Its task was to neutralize Malta as a base for British naval and air forces. Then it was to interfere with British supply routes. Its third task was to support German operations in North Africa.
Malta was totally dependent on Great Britain for supplies. Convoys had to run a 600-mile gauntlet at risk of attack by aircraft, U-boats, or motor torpedo boats. Fliegerkorps 10 began its onslaught with an attack on Force H, a huge British convoy that included the aircraft carrier Illustrious. German Stukas slammed bombs into the deck of the Illustrious, but it managed to limp into the Grand Harbor at Malta. It was the beginning of what was known as the Illustrious Blitz. There were 4 attempts to resupply Malta by convoys from January through March 1941. Most were thwarted by the Germans, and only 26,000 tons of supplies reached port. Then, for the next 3 months, nothing came through. The fighter force on Malta was replenished by flying land-based aircraft off carriers stationed just outside the range of Axis bombers.
But the Germans would attack British aircraft as soon as they landed. They hammered Malta every day. They established air superiority and bombed docks and airfields repeatedly. the German forces based on Sicily had an advantage. Because they were so close to Malta, radar warning came too late for the RAF defenders to gain altitude.
Surprisingly, the German bombing attacks caused relatively few casualties, but they achieved what the Germans set out to accomplish, the suppression of attacks on Axis shipping. British losses were heavy, as high as 25% for sustained periods. Replacement pilots were thrust into battle without any chance of acclimatizing themselves to conditions on Malta.
In April 1941, the German units began to withdraw. They had to prepare for Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. The Italian Air Force took over the attacks on Malta. Their level of intensity was lower. The greatest opportunity for an invasion was gone.
In the fall of 1941, the Germans faced a crisis in supplying Rommel's troops in North Africa. In October, 63% of all cargoes dispatched to North Africa was sunk. The Germans decided to gain air and sea supremacy between southern Italy and Africa. Field Marshal Kesselring assumed command of all German Air Force units in the Mediterranean. Kesselring's Luftflotte II was brought from the Russian front, weakening the Luftwaffe's attack on Moscow. Kesselring's assault began in late December and lasted through May. Sorties, sometimes approaching 5,000 per month, suppressed British attacks on Axis shipping. German supplies were now able to reach North Africa, building up for what was to be an ever-changing war.
The vast North African desert has been described as a tactician's paradise and a quartermaster's hell. The open, flat terrain lent itself to engagements much like great naval battles. But the long distances and harsh climate made sustaining units in combat very difficult. The series of 5 campaigns in the desert has been described as a battle of the airfields. The air power of each advancing army diminished as it had to use unprepared airfields. But the retreating army gained strength as it fell back on prepared airfields.
The first British success in the Western Desert began in November 1940. Operation Compass turned into an offensive that rolled the Italians all the way out of Libya. The RAF only had a ragtag collection of aircraft, but its aggressive tactics quickly established air superiority over the Italian Air Force. The British Western Desert Force defeated the last of the Italian army at the Battle of Beda Fom on February the 6th, 1941. In the campaign, the British pushed on almost to Tripoli. They captured 130,000 prisoners and virtually all of the Italian armor and artillery. The Italian Air Force lost 58 aircraft in combat and hundreds more on the ground.
The British did not press on the few extra miles to Tripoli. It was a grave error. Hitler now sent General Erwin Rommel to command what would soon become famous as the Deutsches Afrika Korps.
2 small-scale divisions, the 5th Light and the 15th Panzer, arrived in Tripoli in March. The Afrika Korps benefited from the heavy raids being carried out on Malta. It was able to gather enough supplies for the first of Rommel's remarkable counter-offensives, which began on March 31st, 1941. Rommel had to conduct his first campaign with almost no air support at all. All of the Axis airfields were so muddy that they were unserviceable. But Rommel's Air Command Africa faced an RAF which was equally weak.
The RAF had 4 squadrons in Africa, 1 of Lysanders, 1 of Blenheim IVs, and 2 of Hurricanes. The RAF force was gradually built up, but with difficulty. The route for British reinforcements was agonizing. Aircraft were sent by ship. They traveled around the Cape of Good Hope and through the Red Sea to Egypt. It took 70 days. A flying route was established from Takoradi in West Africa, but that was a 3,700-mile journey that exhausted the crews. Over 90% of the aircraft made it through, but on arrival they needed immediate overhaul and repair. A curious war within a war developed. The Royal Air Force managed to retain air superiority and launch many missions during Rommel's offensive. But it was unable to prevent the Germans from using their expertise in air, armor, and anti-tank guns to pry open the British defenses. The British Army was simply unable to cope with the Afrika Korps' slashing tactics. It fell to the RAF to prevent the situation from turning into a complete rout. Air Chief Marshal Arthur W. Tedder was appointed Air Officer Commander-in-Chief, Middle East, on May the 5th, 1941. At that stage, he lacked the most important commodity in British service, the confidence of Winston Churchill. Churchill feared that a Russian collapse would free scores of German divisions for Africa. He wanted an offensive as soon as possible to drive Rommel back and preempt the Afrika Korps' next drive.
Both sides built up supplies slowly. Rommel's were interrupted by air activity from Malta, and those of the British 8th Army by the long distances involved.
Great Britain struck first. Operation Crusader was launched on November the 18th, 1941. Britain had overwhelming superiority on the ground and in the air. The British took advantage of the bad weather which was immobilizing the Luftwaffe on its poorly prepared forward bases. Within 3 days, complete air superiority had been established. After some initial setbacks, the British rolled the Afrika Korps all the way back to El Agheila, where the Germans had started out 8 months before.
Meanwhile, the renewed German assault on Malta opened Rommel's supply lines. He made the best use of a minimum resupply of tanks. On January 21st, 1942, he bounced back at the British. He destroyed the strung-out, fuel-short British Army units and recaptured much of the territory he had just lost.
RAF Hurricanes used as fighter bombers saved the day. Fighter bombers were faster than their light bomber counterparts. The Hurricane 1 pointed the way for Hurricane 2s and Typhoons and Thunderbolts. They would carry far heavier armament loads and only a little while later would devastate the enemy.
After Rommel's first thrust, he halted to build up his forces. Opening the port at Benghazi gave him extra supplies. This allowed him to thrust forward again on May 26. It was the beginning of a triumphant march which seemed to confirm the end of the British Empire.
Between February and May 1942, the Western Desert Air Force flew 14,000 sorties against Rommel's forces. The aircraft were obsolete Blenheim light bombers, American P-40 Tomahawks, and Hurricane 1s. 300 aircraft were lost.
The Luftwaffe had a trump card. 120 excellent Messerschmitt Bf 109F fighters, clearly superior to anything the British had.
Overhead, the British Desert Air Force battled it out with the Luftwaffe. The DAF had a slight edge in numbers. 600 aircraft against the 530 of the combined German-Italian force.
The British had greater strength on the ground, but its efforts were badly coordinated. Rommel was able to move forward. He captured Tobruk on June 21, 1942, after a two-day assault. Here the Stukas were again at their most formidable. They destroyed British strong points with incredible accuracy. Rommel was more pleased with the supplies he captured at Tobruk than he was by his promotion to Field Marshal.
For the British, this defeat was a disaster second only to the loss of Singapore to the Japanese. It caused Churchill deep anguish. It raised questions about the fighting worth of the British Army.
But there was also a cost to the Germans. Hitler decided that since Tobruk had been captured, there was no reason to attempt to take Malta. The idea of a seaborne assault on the island had always worried him, and he was glad to have an excuse not to undertake it.
Malta would survive to rebuild itself. It would choke off the Axis air and sea supply routes and become the instrument of Germany's ultimate defeat in Africa. Also, the British defeat would give Churchill further weapons in his argument for an Allied invasion of Africa in 1942.
The nearly exhausted Afrika Korps won another great victory over the British at Mersa Matruh on June 27-28. Then it drove on to fight the First Battle of El Alamein. Its strength was now reduced to 40 tanks. The Luftwaffe was decimated by attrition, the sheer wear and tear of intensive desert service, and a shortage of fuel. There were still 290 Luftwaffe aircraft available, but their mechanics, the Blackbirds, could not create spare parts out of the hot desert air or pump aviation gasoline from the barren desert sand. Rommel decided to fight the Battle of El Alamein with a vastly diminished air force.
In contrast, the British Desert Air Force threw every aircraft it could gather into the fray. In the first week of the battle, it flew almost 5,500 sorties. Rommel was capable of combating superior numbers of tanks on the ground, but his armor melted away in the air assault. He was forced on the defensive. He was hundreds of miles from his supply depots, and his enemy was growing stronger every day.
A waiting game began. It served the British better than the Germans. The Nazi High Command was locked in a great battle on the Eastern Front against 360 Soviet divisions. It saw the British 8th Army in Africa as small potatoes. But the British attitude was different. Africa was the only place where British soldiers were fighting the Germans. Churchill considered the African theater to be critical to the outcome of the war.
Churchill appointed General Sir Harold Alexander as general officer in command. The 8th Army also received a new commander, Lieutenant General Sir Bernard Montgomery.
Montgomery was egotistic and irascible, but he professed regard for air power. He said his first priority was cooperation with the Desert Air Force. He said, there are not two plans, Army and Air, but one plan, Army-Air. Unfortunately, when victory came, Montgomery would claim it as the Army's alone.
August 1942 became the turning point in the Egyptian desert for the Afrika Korps. Alam Halfa was a key hill in the British defenses. It was there that Rommel, the Desert Fox, made his last desperate attempt to win a decision in the Western Desert and march to Cairo. Rommel knew that his inferiority in numbers and supply ruled out a defensive war. He gambled one more time on the offensive.
British ultra-intelligence revealed the date Rommel intended to begin his offensive, August the 30th. Ultra also pinpointed Rommel's convoys, depriving him of as much as 80% of his supplies and 40% of his fuel. Alerted by Ultra, the British began a day and night bombing operation on August the 21st. They secured almost complete command of the air with 22 squadrons of fighters. By September the 2nd, the Desert Air Force had dropped more than 100 tons of bombs against tanks, trucks, and encampments. They devastated the morale of Rommel's troops. The DAF used American-built bombers, Martin Baltimores, Douglas Bostons, and a US AAF squadron of B-25 Mitchells. The German Stukas, once so formidable, had now to jettison their bombs to escape the swarming Allied fighters. In the meantime, Montgomery kept his army entirely on the defensive. He didn't expose his tanks to the threat of Rommel's counterstrokes. It was a pivotal battle for the British Army. From this time forward, it would never be denied air superiority by the Allied air forces. And its expertise in the art of close air support would continue to improve.
The battle for Alam Halfa was immensely significant for the air war. It painted in bold strokes what was in store for Germany. It made an indelible impression on Rommel. When he was later given a command in France to resist the coming invasion, Rommel based all his strategy on the assumption of overwhelming Allied air power.
Rommel had shot his bolt. He could now only withdraw, and Hitler forbade him to do it. He faced a second battle at El Alamein.
Montgomery, with precision and a caution that would become legendary, built up massive amounts of artillery, tanks, and an overwhelming superiority in air power. A blizzard of air attacks raged from October 23rd to November the 4th. The Allies flew 4 times as many sorties as the Axis. The German Stukas were of little use in a defensive mode. The Axis air forces were overwhelmed. The British 8th Army broke Rommel, but despite his losses, his lack of air cover and shortage of fuel and vehicles, he conducted a masterly retreat. Montgomery seemed paralyzed by his victory. He was unable to follow up in the famous desert rat style of the past. At the same time, his uncontrollable ego took over. He took full credit for the victory over Rommel. This started a breakdown in the warm relations he'd had with the air commanders. They were distressed by Montgomery's unwillingness to pursue Rommel. They set up improvised airfields far behind the retreating Afrika Korps and conducted virtual guerrilla operations against the long lines of fleeing Axis vehicles.
The Afrika Korps made it back to Tripoli, from where Rommel had started twice before. Its next battle would be to resist Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa.
United States military officers believed that the main thrust of both air and ground effort should be against Europe. But President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill wanted to get American troops into combat as soon as possible. They prevailed. On November 8, 1942, what was at the time the biggest invasion operation in history took place. 102 ships sailing from the United States landed on the coast of Morocco. A center task force of American troops and British naval forces landed near Oran. An eastern task force landed near Algiers.
Germany aggressively seized a defensive line in Tunisia. It began pouring in equipment, aircraft and manpower. The buildup of forces would include 250,000 soldiers and the latest weapons, including brand new Tiger tanks.
Most of the lessons on close air support, learned at great cost in the Western Desert, were ignored in the opening stages of Operation Torch. There were conflicts within both the RAF and the USAAF. There were also conflicts between the two air forces, and the physical separation of their headquarters prevented any effective cooperation.
The Germans took full advantage of the lack of coordination between Allied air and ground forces. After months of being hounded by the Desert Air Force, the Luftwaffe now ruled the skies over Tunisia. Air superiority for the Germans was not gained by weight of numbers, but by superior aircraft. The Allies still had nothing to match the Bf-109F and the Bf-109G, and the Germans also had the advantage of hard surface airfields. After Rommel's successful retreat from El Alamein, the Germans were able to concentrate their forces in Tunisia. The Axis forces in North Africa now had shortened supply lines. Their priority in the overall war effort was increased.
On the Allied side, Tedder was put in charge of the Mediterranean Air Command. Under him was the American Major General Karl Spaatz. Jimmy Doolittle commanded the Northwest African Strategic Air Force. The RAF veteran Conyngham was given the Northwest Africa Tactical Air Force.
Cooperation between the British and American officers was splendid. The new arrangements swept away past difficulties of personality and bureaucracy. Doolittle's Strategic Air Force had American heavy bombers and British Wellingtons. Conyngham's Tactical Air Force drew from the American 12th Air Force and the British Desert Air Force. The great changes in attitude and approach of the Allied forces would have tremendous bearing on the Battle of the Mareth Line. The Mareth Line had been built by the French as a defense against Italian invasion from Libya. It consisted of old-fashioned forts, tank obstacles, and artillery. The Allied air forces heavily outnumbered the Axis forces. Important new aircraft had been added to the inventory. Spitfires were now available to combat the Messerschmitts. The Hurricane 2D made its appearance. Two 40mm cannon under the wings reduced its speed, but made it deadly against tanks. At a time when the German Air Transport Force was being throttled into extinction, the Allied airlift capability was coming into its own. It would increase on a scale unimagined by any Air Force or Army commander.
The Desert Air Force won the Battle of the Mareth Line with a furious assault that began with level bombing attacks that kept enemy troops in their positions. This was followed by continuous flights of fighter bombers that sought out the German anti-tank teams and destroyed them. In just over 2 hours, 412 sorties by the Desert Air Force cracked open the Mareth Line so that tanks could push through without difficulty.
From this point on, the fate of the Axis troops in Tunisia was sealed. Yet the Germans continued attempting to resupply on a lavish scale. But Allied bombers virtually sealed off Tunisian ports and picked off individual ships trying to sneak in.
The Luftwaffe tried to pick up the slack by making 150 sorties a day in both the standard Junkers Ju-52 and the new 6-engined Messerschmitt Me-323 Gigant, a mammoth-converted glider that could carry 10 tons of fuel. The Gigant was originally designed as a transport to support Hitler's Blitzkrieg, lightning war. But in the Mediterranean, it would be at the mercy of the Allies.
The Allied forces responded with 4 separate massive victories in the air. On 2 days, early in April, P-38s shot down more than 60 German planes. Some were transports, and some were escorting convoys. Then on April 18th, the famous Palm Sunday massacre occurred. Three squadrons of P-40s, with British Spitfires flying top cover, intercepted a huge formation of more than 100 Ju-52s. They were escorted by Bf-109s, 110s, and Macchi Castoldi Folgores. "78 Axis aircraft were shot down. 51 of them were transports. The Allies lost 7 aircraft. On April 22nd, a formation of 21 fuel-carrying Messerschmitt Gigants were caught over the Gulf of Tunis by Allied fighters. They were completely destroyed. The huge aircraft blew up in spectacular fashion. In 17 days, Axis transport losses reached a total of 435. The losses came after the German disaster in Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe's transport strength in aircraft and crews was destroyed.
The Tunisian fighting ended on May 13th, 1943. The Axis defeat was as great as at Stalingrad. 250,000 prisoners were taken. From this point on, Allied air power would reign supreme. It would meet only token resistance through the invasions of Sicily, Italy, and southern France.
The German infantryman, considered even by his enemies to be the best in the world, soon learned to fight hard defensive battles without air cover.
The fighting in the Mediterranean theater had seen the introduction of several important new American aircraft into the combat. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning proved to be highly versatile. It was used for long-range escort, reconnaissance, and ground attack. The Lightning was never to be the success in the European theater that it became in the Pacific, but it was a valuable commodity in the desert. The Bell P-39 was valuable in the ground attack role, but it had to be escorted because it could not hold its own against enemy fighters. Among the bombers, the North American B-25 demonstrated that it was a workhorse. The Martin B-26 Marauder overcame its original notoriety as a crew killer. It was to become one of the most highly respected bombers of the war. The effectiveness of the new Allied generation of fighter bombers was enhanced by a new communications system. This would later become known as FACS, Forward Air Controllers. Experienced observers, first on the ground and later flying in grasshoppers, small aircraft like the Piper Cub and the Auster, began picking up targets and marking them with smoke from rockets.
The campaign in the Mediterranean had been bitterly opposed by many of the Allied generals, but it actually proved to be the best possible school for warfare. The United States Army Air Forces learned the demanding science of air-ground cooperation at relatively low cost. They would apply it well in the invasion of Europe.
The lessons learned were incorporated into a new field manual. It was published on July 21st, 1943. It would govern the great air armies that would demolish Hitler's fortress Europe. Field Manual 100-20 stated that land power and air power are co-equal and interdependent forces. Neither is an auxiliary of the other. The manual further emphasized that the gaining of air superiority is the first requirement for the success of any major land operation. Finally, it dictated that control of available air power must be centralized and command must be exercised through the Air Force commander if this inherent flexibility and ability to deliver a decisive blow are to be fully exploited.
The Germans believed this. The Russians had learned it the hard way, but the Allied forces would exploit it to a degree never before achieved.